Hey everybody, and thank you for joining me today. If you're new here, my name is Jeff Fagan. I'm a filmmaker and DP based in South Florida, and you are watching the Reach Films podcast. Now, you may have joined us live on the YouTube channel yesterday and looked at yourself and noticed, why are we doing a similar episode to yesterday? Well, there were some audio problems with yesterday's episode, and instead of having to go through and do the podcast separately, I figured I would just not only answer some of the questions that went on from yesterday's episode, but a lot was brought up in Red's Q&A last night that I didn't go over, and I figured it would be best to just do it all in one episode today. So, in today's episode, we are going over Red's newly released V-Raptor camera. We are also talking about some new items for the Komodo, really specifically one new item for the Komodo that was announced yesterday, and some of the few little interesting tidbits we found out through watching Red's Q&A. Now, if you're watching me live, if you can let me know if you hear me in the chat, as I know I can go forward without these audio problems, be super appreciated. And without further ado, we'll get going soon. All right, let's bring up Red's Velociraptor. I'm actually solved my issues with my streaming yesterday. Let's do this. Let's take off the top banner. And here we are. Here is the V-Raptor from Red. It is $24,500 for the Stormtrooper edition, which is sold out already. The other thing that I found out is actually the Black Edition is going to be $24,500. There is no additional charge for the Stormtrooper version of this specific camera. I was trying to find that information out yesterday during Red's stream. I asked multiple times. Nobody answered it, but luckily someone was nice enough to answer me on the Komodo Facebook users group, which if you are not joined, I would absolutely recommend joining. I find out most of the information about Komodo within that group, and everyone's really helpful. It's probably one of the best Facebook groups I have joined and been a part of, so I would absolutely join that if you're interested in the Komodo or some of the new Red cameras. So let's go through and look at the V-Raptor. I always think it's the Velociraptor, but they're naming it the V-Raptor, so I'm going to go with that. So here's some images of the V-Raptor. You notice it's very similar to the Komodo. And something I mentioned in yesterday's episode, which I'll mention again since this is the podcast version, I'm noticing Red and Apple have some synergy in what they are doing, how they're coming out with products. And what I mean by that is, you notice the V-Raptor is similar to Komodo, and as we go through some of the specs, you're going to notice, like you see right here, it's got Wi-Fi, it's got USB-C, even though the Komodo does not have USB-C. It does have the Komodo Link, which offers USB-C. It's got 2 SDIs, but it's also got some improvements. It's got internal audio, much better internal audio, but it also has the EXT port, breakout port like the Komodo. So where I think Apple and Red have some interesting synergy is, if you follow Apple, Apple came out last year after Red announced the Komodo and released the Komodo, their M1 computers. And what the M1 computers allowed Apple to do was put the same powerful chipset in computers such as the Mac Mini, MacBook Air, and put them at affordable price points to bring in people to their ecosystem that probably never would have been in the Apple ecosystem, kind of like Red did with the Komodo, putting it at a really great price point, bringing in people into the Red ecosystem. I'm one of those people. I have rented Red cameras before, but I never purchased one due to the amount of times I use them per year. It just was never financially viable for me to do so, but the Komodo made it so. And not only did they bring people like me into their ecosystem, but they got to essentially beta test a lot of features that they were going to do in DSMC3. Jared Land, the president of Red, pretty much said that early on with the Komodo, and Apple's pretty much doing the same thing with their M1, where they're beta testing a lot of things on Apple Silicon with a crazy more amount of users. I mean, Apple M1, they've sold so many computers in the past year. I think it's like their best-selling lineup that they've had in a really long time, and I'm sure the Komodo is one of the best-selling lineups. So one of the things we can tell off the bat that I think Red learned from the Komodo launch is, you see there is the positive locking RF mount right here. And that was huge, because if you're a Komodo user, you probably noticed there is some wiggle in the mount. And it's unfortunate. There's ways to lock it down. Pretty much the best way is from kip or tie. I'm sure there's going to be better ways in the future. Actually, I 3D printed. Let me grab it. Here we go. A really nice user in the Red Komodo users group released this STL file, and I 3D printed this lock to pretty much keep the Komodo locked on. But there are ways around it, but Red obviously has finalized and fixed this with the positive locking mount. So that was pretty cool. I'm really stoked on that they did that. They also answered a problem that we had where, although they still did it, you see that there's still a record button on the right side of the V-Raptor. They also put one in the front on the bottom left, which is more normal to where, you can go access it easy. I've actually used the side record button on my Komodo a few times just because I want that physical record button. A lot of people bought the outrigger handle to solve that problem for them, but I notice when I'm using the Komodo, it's a lot of the times either in a gimbal, tripod, or slider setup, and handheld, or shoulder mount. But at the same time, in all those situations, it's kind of hard not only to hit the side button, but it's also, I never really use the outrigger handle. I never would because of the placement of the camera. So it's good to see that they answered that problem. So let's do this. Let's go through the specs of the camera. I'll answer any questions you guys have once we go through the specs. I know this is something we did yesterday, but again, this is a brand new episode of the podcast. And then we'll go through some of the really interesting things that was discussed in the Red Q&A that I don't, if you missed it, you absolutely want to stay tuned because it's some interesting and really good information. And before we go on, here is the Komodo. Here, I won't magnify it. There's the Komodo next to the V-Raptor, and very similar in look. As a Komodo owner, I'm actually extremely pleased that the look is so similar. I know that a lot of Monstro and Helium owners are kind of not stoked that it's so small, but without giving too much away, there are going to be solutions for you guys that is not specifically this camera coming up. We'll go over that a little bit later on. So let's go over the specs of the camera. Yeah, so it is 8K, 120 frames per second. The sensor size is slightly smaller than the Monstro, but not big enough to where I would say makes a difference. It doesn't take it out of the full frame realm. It's totally a full frame Vista Vision sensor. 17 plus stops of dynamic range. On the stream last night, they mentioned it is slightly higher in dynamic range than the Monstro, but it's kind of like, it's so slight, it's hard to mention how slight it is. Obviously, with this version of the camera, we have the integrated RF mount, although the main difference is we have the positive lock. As far as frame rates, I'm just going to notate the 17:9 frame rates that is here on the website, and I'll also put a link in the description below. But it's 120 frames at 8K 17:9. Got 140 frames per second at 7K 17:9. 160 frames per second at 6K in 17:9, 192 frames per second at 5K in 17:9, 240 frames per second at 4K in 17:9, 320 frames per second at 3K 17:9, and 480 frames per second at 2K 17:9. Now, I don't know, me personally, if I'd crop past 5K on this sensor. Maybe I'd do 4K if I really needed it. That's a pretty heavy crop. I'd be interested to see what the crop sizes are. Phil Holland mentioned that 3K was similar to Super 16. So at least that kind of gives you some kind of bearing. 4K is bigger than Super 16. With the red code, it is similar to Komodo again, and we'll discuss it a little bit more, but just to touch on it, they are using the HQ, MQ, and LQ compression ratios. The one thing to note, though, is that if you're shooting 8K, you can only shoot 120 frames per second in the LQ mode. which I did not catch until the live stream last night. I did not know that was a thing. So it is, you should note that if you want to shoot 120 frames per second, that is in the LQ only mode at 8K. It seems that also there's similar limitations at 6K, where you can shoot 160 frames per second in the MQ and LQ mode only. If you want to shoot in HQ, it will go up to 96 frames per second. Then we go down to 4K, and then there is no limitations anymore. HQ, MQ, LQ up to 240 at 2K. HQ, MQ, and LQ up to 480. So no limitations at that point. There are anamorphic modes on this camera. I'll let you guys read through that on your own. Again, the link will be in the description below. The camera body without a body cap or CFexpress card will be 4.03 pounds. There is an integrated V-Lock battery instead of the BP that we see on the Komodo, which makes a lot of sense because I think the camera is big enough to where you're going to be using a V-mount. I use a V-Lock battery on my Komodo all the time. I really use the BP batteries in two situations. If I'm using a small one-handed gimbal like this Crane 2S right by my side over here, if you're watching the YouTube version, you can kind of see it. Or if I'm doing a super, super portable, stripped down handheld where maybe I'm even using my phone as my monitor, I'll use the BP batteries. Otherwise, it's V-mount, V-Lock, however you say it. And it makes sense that they went that route with this camera. Other than that, there's no new processing for the color management. It is IPP2. With the audio, they do integrated dual channel digital mono microphones, uncompressed 24-bit, 48 kilohertz, integrated dual channel. It does do 48 volt out through the 5-pin audio port. They're going to make some kind of adapter for it, which is really good to see that there's some proper audio ways to process audio, get audio into this newer camera, because that was an issue with Komodo and obviously prior Red cameras as well, unless you had some of the bigger boys renting them out. There is Wi-Fi on this camera, which you can use the Red Control app, and not only that, but you'll also have similar features to Komodo, like being able to monitor an image on a computer. That's something that I actually want to experiment more on, and I will in a shoot upcoming where I am going to be using some wireless transmitters with other cameras, but the Komodo is going to be static, so I want to see if I can pull it up on my computer, get a nice big image, even though I think on the Komodo, I believe, outputs a 720p signal, whereas the V-Raptor will do a 1080p signal. And then also you have the dual SDI inputs or outputs. They are 12G. 12G is the new standard. It's not just on Red, but it's on RE. So although if you're like me, I have not had issues with my 12G, but there's been a lot of issues. So I'm interested to see how that gets handled. And with this new V-Raptor camera, there is also a REDUX 7-inch LCD monitor that they partnered with SMALLRIG on. Looks really nice. It is pretty expensive. I'll pull it up. Let's pull it up actually here, because the last thing is Red Control. So let's see if they have V-Raptor. Well, there's a Belkin Ethernet adapter. That's cool to see. I guess these are the third-party accessories. So let's go accessories, displays. Just wanted to touch on this. So here is the DSMC3 REDUX display. Now it is $2,750 if you decide to go with it. So it is pricey, but it's to be expected from Red with this kind of capabilities. Interesting, they went with the SMALLRIG logo on this REDUX, but again, they did partner with them, so it does make sense. And I'm just coming back to comments. If you guys have any comments, questions, please feel free to put them in. But without further ado, that is the V-Raptor camera. that's really the nitty gritty information on what's coming out. One thing we did find out is for now, and let me pull this. Let me pull me back. All right. So one of the things we did find out is that in the beginning with the CFexpress cards, this camera will be using CFexpress cards. They actually are only using the Red branded CFexpress cards and Angelbird Express CFexpress cards, which Red has partnered with Angelbird to make their CFexpress cards. Right now, there aren't any third-party available, at least third-party that you could buy that will be Red approved. That may happen in the future, but unlike the Komodo at launch, right now there isn't. So that was interesting to see that they decided to do that. Now, let's go. Soto Cine, thank you for joining me, my friend, and thank you for letting me know about the audio. It was crazy yesterday, and that's why we are redoing it. And again, for those listening in the audio version of the podcast, we are doing this live on YouTube. So if you do want to watch this live, make sure to hit the subscribe button to stay up to date when I do go live. So thank you again for letting me know about that yesterday, my friend. So we are going to move on to the Q&A from Red, and there's 3 pieces of information that you need to know if you missed it. So let's go to the first. V-Raptor XL. So what Jared slipped out is that there are going to be different versions of the V-Raptor. And I was happy to hear that because I had some friends that were not super stoked that this was very similar to the Komodo as far as its form factor. And they're going to be, and also they weren't happy that it was an RF mount. So apparently there's going to, at least one of the versions, be an XL V-Raptor camera. And that XL V-Raptor camera will have interchangeable lens mounts. So if you don't want to have to use adapters on the RF mount, you will not have to use adapters on the RF mount. And that was the first bit of information. We will find out more soon. The next, which I'm really excited about, electronic variable ND filter adapter, not only for the V-Raptor with the RF mount, but also for the Komodo. So there are no images of these. These are announcements, but not releases. And I'm assuming it's because they are not finished yet. But Red is working on an RF mount to EF and an RF mount to PL electronic variable ND filter. Meaning that you'll be able to control this thing electronically in the camera and on the Red Control app, which is pretty cool. So if you're interested in that, make sure to keep yourself posted on that, as there are obviously the drop-in filters. There are other options you can go with, but having the electronic variable ND is a pretty cool product. Really depending on what price point it comes out at, it could really put a dent in what Breakthrough is doing if the quality is better, but time will tell. We will see as that comes on. The last thing, Red code compression. So a lot of us have been touting, because this is what was told to us when Komodo came out, and apparently this has changed a little bit. The compressions of Red code, HQ, MQ, and LQ, we always assumed it was 2-to-1, 5-to-1, and 8-to-1. After yesterday's stream, it is apparent that that is actually not the case, and that HQ, the lowest compression of HQ, is apparently a compression that we have not seen before on prior Red cameras. It is the lowest compression they have offered, and MQ is actually similar to what the lowest compression that has been offered has been. So I'm not exactly sure where LQ stands compression-wise then, as that means MQ is, if they're saying it's close to the highest, I'm guessing it's around 2-to-1, which it makes me interested to see what HQ ends up being. So that was a really interesting tidbit of information, especially because that means that the HQ on V-Raptor is going to be a lower compression that was offered on Monstro. Now they're saying for HQ to use it on VFX, stuff like that. It's not to be used in all situations. Even on the Komodo myself, I actually film in LQ most of the time, unless I'm doing feature work. And I've only done like one really important job where I shot, I did shoot an HQ at the time because I didn't want to risk shooting an MQ, so we just kept switching out the CFast 2.0 cards. But yeah, for the most part, I have shot an LQ. So it's interesting to see that. So with that is the information. That is the sum of kind of what went on yesterday. If you joined me again in the live stream, thank you for joining today again. Again, I wanted to do this to do a nice, clean episode of the podcast, and that will be up on reachfilms.com shortly. So without further ado, I'm going to end it over here. Thank you, everybody, for watching me live. And until next time, my name's Jeff Fagan. Thanks for watching again, and I will see you in the next one.